Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by James CJ, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel if you're not, ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. Let's get to it. Race in America has long been a point of contention across the nation. Today, it's nowhere near as horrific as it was during the days of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the fight for civil rights. Right? However, now that diversity, equity, inclusion, and the mere mention of Black history have become trigger words for a certain percentage of the population, it's clear that this issue isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And we think it's important to highlight a figure who did much to further the civil rights of women and people of color. To be clear, many people have fought against racial injustice and for women's rights, but among the most famous, who also happens to be the subject of today's video, is Ida B. Wells. Ida's life was one of constant fighting. An early leader in the civil rights movement, she fought for equality and justice. Her life was multifaceted, with her fight extending to many different corners of America's very existence post-Civil War. She may not have been able to see the changes she championed as much as others, but she was a pioneer in bringing these issues to the forefront of American society and policy. A mother, an investigative journalist, a civil rights activist, a teacher, a lecturer, a suffragist, and an anti-lynching crusader. Few people have the kind of resume that Ida B. Wells had, a life that deserves to be known, celebrated, and understood. Ida B. Wells was born on July 16, 1862, on the Bowling Farm in Mississippi near Holly Springs. Ida was the first of 9 children. Born into slavery in the South, as 1862 was during the heat of the Civil War, and Mississippi was a Confederate state. The area frequently traded hands between the Union and the Confederacy as the war raged on. By the time the Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, Ida was 3 years old, and she and her family were free Americans. In the early years post-slavery, her father, James Madison Wells, known commonly as Jim, son of a slave and enslaver, became a successful carpenter in Holly Springs, while also becoming heavily involved in politics supporting the Republican Party. Her mother, Lizzie, became known as a locally famous cook. The two were both slaves on the Bowling Plantation. Reconstruction was by no means an easy time to be Black in the South. The Southerners were still bitter about their defeat in the emancipation of the slaves. Despite all this, the Wells family prospered, not just surviving, but thriving in a post-slavery America, as much as an African-American family could in the South at least. This was thanks in large part to the skills her parents possessed as opposed to other former slaves. Ida went on to enroll in Rust College, which was then called Shaw College. During its early years, this historically Black liberal arts college taught elementary and higher education. This college is known as an HBCU, which stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Her father was one of the school's trustees, and her mother also attended along with Ida and her siblings, although not full-time like her children. Growing up, Ida would see the efforts of her parents in education, work, and politics. Jim Wells was actively involved in the political scene in Holly Springs, working with other local Republicans to get numerous Black candidates elected at the local, state, and federal levels. This was during the time of the Ku Klux Klan, or otherwise known as the KKK, which had been formed years after the Civil War and worked against these efforts in service of the Democratic Party of the time. Obviously, Democrats today would never align themselves with the KKK. It just goes to show you that political parties really do change and evolve drastically throughout the decades. Through voter intimidation, racially motivated violence, and even murder, the KKK worked to decimate Republican efforts across the South to bring a new level of inclusivity to politics, a fact that struck fear in Lizzie Wells, determination in Jim Wells, and a fighting spirit in Ida. In September of 1878, tragedy struck when a yellow fever epidemic broke out in the Mississippi Valley region. The outbreak was a particularly deadly one, too. Holly Springs was not an area prone to yellow fever, but the combined effects of the virulent strain originating in Tennessee, the hot summer weather which allowed for the excessive breeding of mosquitoes, the lack of immunity in Mississippi, and the mayor not cautioning people while also allowing infected people to come into town meant it spread like wildfire. Ida was on her grandparents' farm in rural Mississippi and believed that if it was bad enough, Jim and Lizzie would bring their family to the farm if necessary. Unfortunately, they didn't. Jim died September 26, 1878, and Lizzie died the next day. Ida traveled home 3 days after reading of their deaths. Her decision to go home was in spite of the overwhelming evidence that she shouldn't, as the disease was still ravaging Holly Springs. This was the end of her childhood. At 16, Ida B. Wells was forced into adulthood, no longer a sibling but instead a stand-in for her parents. Upon returning home, Ida discovered that her 9-month-old brother Stanley had perished along with her parents. This left her remaining 6 siblings in her immediate care. Family, friends, and relatives believed the remaining Wells children should be separated and sent to foster homes. Ida disagreed. To keep her broken family together, she got a job as a teacher in a rural black elementary school outside the city of Holly Springs. Initially, her grandmother helped with caring for her siblings in her absence, but she suffered a stroke and never recovered, leaving Ida alone yet again. Eventually, an old friend of her mother's came in to help when Ida was at work during the week. In 1881, Ida's Aunt Fanny offered for Ida and her remaining young siblings to come and live with her in Memphis, Tennessee. Her disabled sister Eugenia went to live with another aunt in the country. Her now-of-age brothers remained in Holly Springs, while Ida and her 2 young sisters went to Memphis. In Memphis, Ida's adult life began to take shape. With far less responsibility on her shoulders, she was able to start socializing and dating. Here, she went from humble and hard beginnings as a teacher in Shelby County to becoming an activist and well-known journalist, with a reputation as a heartless flirt to cap it all off. By 1883, a couple of years after moving to Tennessee, Ida completed the city's school teacher's exam and finally found a school willing to hire her. During that 2-year period prior to completing her exam, she continued her work as a rural school teacher in Woodstock, 10 miles outside the city. She stayed in Woodstock during the week before returning to Memphis for the weekends, similar to how she worked in Mississippi. These early years weren't easy for Ida. Financially, she was struggling, especially given that she had to support herself and her 2 sisters while also sending money to help her brothers and other sister, who all lived in Mississippi. Ida's ambition was to be a part of the black elite in Memphis, and that's what she worked towards every day. Eventually, her Aunt Fanny moved to Visalia, California, taking Ida's 2 sisters with her, which meant a reduced burden on Wells, even though she still had to send money on her sister's behalf, sending $10 a month, which is equivalent to just over $300 today. To add further pressure to her already fragile financial situation, Ida also needed a place to live, which meant paying rent. Where Ida lived changed frequently as she continued struggling to meet her financial obligations. Some of Ida's financial issues were of her own making, considering her middle-class aspirations meant she often attempted to act the part, resulting in spending money she didn't have. Ida had managed at this time to leverage her father's reputation in political circles to her advantage in accessing the Memphis black elite. She was living a life she simply couldn't afford, but it's hard to argue that she wasn't doing the smart thing long-term. While the argument can be made that she gained a lot of her early connections through her father's reputation, what she did with those connections was her own doing. By the end of 5 years in Memphis, Wells transformed from a small-town girl into a city girl. She also slowly became an accomplished writer, working in an editorial position at the Evening Star, a small Memphis journal. She also wrote under a pseudonym for the Living Way newspaper, in which she targeted and attacked Jim Crow policies. Wells was a journalist in America at a time when there weren't many female journalists, and when there were even fewer female journalists of color. She was one of 45 black female journalists in America. By 1889, she'd come to be the editor and co-owner of the Free Speech and Headlight. However, while theoretically free speech at the time held consequences for people of color. Wells was dismissed from her teaching job in 1891 for her articles criticizing the conditions of black schools. Despite being heartbroken by the decision, Ida threw herself into her work at the paper, continuing to investigate Black America, and this led to her entering the fight against one of the more wicked practices of the 19th and 20th centuries: lynching. In 1889, Ida's friend Thomas Henry Moss Sr. opened People's Grocery in South Memphis in a neighborhood nicknamed The Curve in modern-day Mississippi Boulevard and Walker Avenue. He and his family were close friends of Wells, and she was the godmother to his first child. His store, which was owned by Moss and the community and where he worked nights after his postmanship, was rather successful. However, that success came at the expense of a grocery store across the road, a white-owned store called Barrett's Grocery, owned by William Russell Barrett. On March 2, 1892, an incident occurred, the details of which are slightly unclear. However, this incident resulted in Barrett being injured. He blamed one of the People's Grocer clerks, William Stewart, in the hopes of discrediting Moss's store. He went with a sheriff to arrest Stewart the next day, but he wasn't there. Another clerk, Calvin McDowell, was there and another incident occurred. McDowell refused to give up Stewart, so Barrett struck him with a revolver, but faltered, dropping the weapon, which McDowell then picked up and fired at Barrett, just missing him. This led to Barrett being deputized by a Shelby County court judge and given permission to get revenge. The People's Grocer knew an attack was imminent, and they asked for help from Memphis authorities, but they said the curve was just outside of their jurisdiction and refused. On Saturday, March 5th, Barrett arrived with numerous others, and a gunfight ensued, leaving several of Barrett's men injured. Eventually, Barrett had local media on his side, claiming that Moss and the People's Grocery were planning a race war, black versus white, which led to white mobs storming the curve, damaging property, and searching for Moss, Stewart, and McDowell. To avoid further damage to the community, the three turned themselves in and remained at the county jail awaiting trial. They'd never get due process, because on March 9, 1892 at 2:30 a.m., Barrett stormed the jail with 75 other masked men and apprehended the three, took them a mile north of the city, and mutilated and murdered 3 innocent men whose only crime was having a business slightly more successful than a white man's, pushing against intimidation and defending themselves against racially motivated aggression. Lynching was a means of warning African Americans to stay in their lane, so to speak. Don't push against the racial hierarchy that existed in the South. Freedom from slavery, achieved only a few decades prior in 1865, didn't mean the South was ready to hand over rights, upward mobility, economic advantage, or privileges to African Americans. It was quite the opposite. Most papers wrote of the lynching as justice. Ida, having just lost a close friend, attacked those who were part of, supportive of, or ignorant of the lynching. While the lynching at the curve wasn't Ida's story, it was a pivotal point in her development in her fight against lynching in America. As Wells began investigating lynchings further, a lynching in Tunica, Mississippi in 1892 caught her attention. After investigating the situation, she concluded that a black man had been lynched because her father stated his daughter was having a sexual relationship with the black man, and he needed to save her reputation. Of course, it was played up as assault when reported, which prompted revenge. Ida's newspaper refuted it in an editorial stating that old threadbare lie that Negro men white women. If Southern men are not careful, a conclusion might be reached, which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. Basically, stop your lying, bitch. On May 25, 1892, her newspaper was ransacked by white Southerners with a proclivity to reinforce self-determined race rules in the South, and ultimately destroyed the building and everything in it. This wasn't the end of Wells's growing problems in Memphis. She was becoming more and more of a target by the day. After the newspaper was attacked, authorities were looking for Wells, awaiting her return from Manhattan, where she was visiting at the time of the attack. With all this, Ida made a difficult decision. She turned her back on Memphis. She remained in New York and began working for the New York Age. In 1892, Wells also published Southern Horrors, which was a pamphlet detailing her research, specifically lynching cases where the victims were accused of assaulting white women. She concluded that most of the time these weren't the real reasons for the victims' lynchings, and that they were often due to black economic progress, which white Southerners detested and saw as a threat to their own economic progress. This was a long-held sentiment in the South and was the basis for many laws trying to suppress African Americans to ensure economic progress. You know, it's the age-old political tactic of saying, hey, they're the real bad guys, don't look at my pile of gold here. It went beyond economics and bled into politics, with white politicians finding numerous ways to disenfranchise black people and even poor white people through the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and various other measures. In 1895, Wells published The Red Record, a 100-page pamphlet that was a sociological investigation of lynching since the end of slavery, bringing attention to the horrors of the South to Northerners who'd been almost oblivious. It wasn't just Northerners who were oblivious, but also African Americans. In the 1880s, lynchings increased in frequency and volume while also becoming more mainstream and less covert. Sound familiar? While she continued advocating for legislative solutions, she acknowledged the need for black people to arm themselves, stating, "The Winchester rifle deserved a place of honor in every black home." The law wasn't coming to save them. They needed to protect themselves. In 1893, not long after Ida was exiled from Memphis and took refuge in New York, Wells met widower Ferdinand Lee Barnett, a Chicago attorney, journalist, and civil rights activist. Barnett had founded the first black newspaper in Chicago in 1878, the Chicago Crusader. And through that paper, Wells and Barnett worked on a pamphlet protesting a lack of African American representation in the World's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in 1893. From this, she'd begin working for the paper that same year and eventually became a partial owner. By June 27, 1895, Ida B. Wells married Barnett and became the stepmother to Barnett's 2 children. Together, the couple would have 4 additional children. Before she began having children with Barnett, however, she was part of another fight, the suffrage movement. It should come as no surprise that Ida B. Wells's fight for equality extended to the suffrage movement as well. They were inextricably linked to her views on the enfranchisement of women being both pragmatic and political. The suffrage movement, however, was populated primarily by white women, led by Frances Willard, the first president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. The WCTU was a pivotal player in the movement for prohibition, but it also advocated for numerous societal changes, including women's enfranchisement. Wells and Willard were often at odds due to Ida's strong position on lynching and violence against blacks in the South, but in particular was an event in 1893, while the 2 women were on separate lecture tours across Britain. Willard blamed African Americans for the failure of success in temperance legislation. Ida used the comments of Willard and her criticism of Ida to her advantage to further her point of how white leaders sought to diminish women of color. Unfortunately, Willard was willing to sacrifice Ida to achieve the WCTU's goals and, in a way, even subscribed to some of the accusations that African Americans faced, which led to extreme violence against them, men in particular. Her social purity campaigns, which were a major part of the late 19th century and early 20th century, had a pointed focus on the racial politics of rape, and seeing as the group was predominantly white, it meant that they were unwilling to denounce lynching and instead pursued safeguarding the development of the Anglo-Saxon race. Yeah, it is exactly as bad as it sounds. It goes without saying that Ida respected Willard's fight, but disagreed with her heavily on some key issues. As Ida began having children, her work and activism slowed down, but never stalled. In her autobiography, she opined that splitting her time between her work and her family remained a challenge. In some cases, she found ways to combine her efforts, such as when she established the first kindergarten that prioritized black children. When Frederick Douglass passed in 1895, it was believed that Wells would succeed him as a leader in the civil rights fight, but several factors counted against her that she was unable to overcome. For starters, there was the obvious challenge of her being a mother with young children to care for, which meant her activity as an activist, while not stalled, was somewhat diminished. Additionally, she was a woman. Despite the respect she'd achieved in her anti-lynching campaign being real, it wasn't necessarily enough to overcome the prescribed role women had in society at the time. Politics was a man's game, and Ida was not only a woman but also a mother, so she never fulfilled the criteria to take over Douglass's mantle to lead the fight for equality and racial justice. She wasn't just fighting for racial equality, but gender equality too, which existed in all racial groups going into the 20th century. As the 20th century rolled around, Ida continued her fight while also raising her children. Her focus became far more localized to Chicago, starting with school segregation in 1900, where she began lobbying the publisher of the Chicago Tribune after the paper released a series of articles advocating for segregation in Chicago schools, which Wells knew from experience was a failure. Her lobbying efforts didn't produce results, so she worked with social reformer Jane Addams to help her. Together, the two defeated the attempt to segregate the Chicago school system, a major win. In 1908, Wells and Barnett, along with several members of their church, founded the Negro Fellowship League, or the NFL. No, not that one. This NFL was born from the Springfield race riots of 1908, which saw a wave of violence against black communities by white people after an alleged assault of a white woman by two black men. The riots saw thousands loot and destroy businesses, 2 black men were lynched, and 7 people died before order was restored. As a result of black migration from the South, many young black people came from the South with agricultural roots and lacked the skills needed for the northern job market as well as a social support network, which the NFL hoped to answer. The NFL provided not only accommodation, job training, and placement, but also, thanks to Barnett, legal aid for young black men accused of crimes. Ida was also one of the founding members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909. But she eventually cut ties with the organization as she was disillusioned with leadership and believed they lacked action-based initiatives. Continuing her work in the women's suffrage movement, Ida, fed up with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, created the Alpha Suffrage Club, or the ASC, on January 30th, 1913. The ASC is believed to have been the first black suffrage club in both Chicago and the United States. It took in black women excluded from the NAWSA. The ASC would go on to join the NAWSA women at President Wilson's inauguration for a planned suffrage parade. Despite being told that black women were to be present in the back, Ida went and joined the white women regardless of this rule, linking arms with her friends who'd helped her create the ASC. A suffrage victory in 1913 was the Illinois Suffrage Act, which gave women the right to vote for presidential electors, mayors, aldermen, and various other local officers in the state of Illinois, but still excluded them from voting for the governor, state house representatives, and members of Congress. The act became a target of the newly founded ASC until it was signed into law on June 26, 1913. This moment shaped some of the ASC's goals to further the voting rights of all women, but it was also created to educate black women to engage in government and civic matters while electing African Americans across the various government offices. World War I was particularly challenging for black Americans. While the Wilson administration prioritized black patriotism, fearing the Germans would use the U.S. divisions against it, the way the administration and black civil rights leaders approached the topic was different. While black leaders used their patriotic leverage to demand civil rights, the Wilson administration began assembling a surveillance apparatus like the nation had not yet seen. And it was used to target numerous black leaders, labeling many as race agitators, among them Ida B. Wells. There was some level of effort on Wilson's part to take on the issue, but it's clear that black leaders put far more faith in him than he deserved. The 1918 Sedition Act amended the Espionage Act, criminalizing speech deemed disloyal or abusive towards the government, armed forces, or the flag. Its vague language targeted protests, newspapers, and rights leaders. Wilson's relationship with minorities was often contentious. Ida B. Wells found herself targeted by the administration, facing increased surveillance. Nonetheless, she continued her activism, working with her husband and the Board of Pardons, testifying for prisoners. Which just goes to show you, when they try to take away your free speech, your right to speak out against them, you don't stop. You increase your protests. You increase your activism. After all, there's nothing more American than protesting. Just ask the East India Company. Oh wait, you can't. They no longer exist. In the 1920s, Wells suffered several losses. In 1924, she attempted to become a leader of the National Association of Colored Women. This led to the creation of the Third Ward Women's Political Club in 1927, where Ida hoped to become more active in politics. She even attempted to become a delegate to the Republican National Convention, or the RNC, but unfortunately she lost this effort. As the presidency of Republican Herbert Hoover continued, Ida began souring on the Republican Party. She noticed that the party that once stood with African Americans was beginning to walk away from any real effort to fight for civil rights for all. A year before her death, Ida would also make a run for elective office in the Illinois State Legislature Senate elections. She ran as an independent but unfortunately lost the race. On March 21, 1931, Ida returned from a shopping trip and claimed she wasn't feeling well. For the next few days, Ida remained bedridden. On March 23rd, in the morning, William Barnett went to kiss his wife goodbye before heading to work and noticed her forehead was scorching and her eyes were unseeing and unnaturally bright. This prompted him to take her to the local hospital. She lost consciousness on the way and never came to. Instead, passing away at 1 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, March 25, 1931, at age 68. Her official cause of death was uremic poisoning, which is caused by a buildup of waste products in your blood, which occurs as the result of untreated kidney failure. It was the end of the long fight Ida started nearly 5 decades earlier. In the reporting of her death, Ida's contributions to numerous civil rights causes were often marginalized, with a prime example being W.E.B. Du Bois, who called Ida the pioneer of the anti-lynching crusade, but went on to say that when the NAACP took on the challenge, it was at a larger scale and was more effective, thus diminishing Ida's lifelong mission. For decades following her death, there was a risk of Ida fading into historical obscurity. Thankfully, that's not the case. In the preface to Ida B. Wells' autobiography, Crusade for Justice, which remained unfinished by the time of her passing in 1931, Ida expresses her desire to write the book to share the history of her fight while also providing a more accurate depiction of the South post-slavery, which she believed was lacking in authentic historical representation. Between 1882 and 1968, nearly 200 anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress. Of those 200, only 3 passed the House of Representatives, and none succeeded in the Senate due to Southern Democrats arguing that it should be an issue left to the states. While numerous anti-lynching bills were introduced and passed in states across the nation throughout the 20th century, it was only in 2022 that the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was signed into law on March 29, 2022. This marked the only federal anti-lynching bill to succeed in Congress after more than a century of failure at the federal level. While there hasn't been a reported lynching since March 21, 1981, it's long been believed that lynchings continued, just with more anonymity, to the point where it wasn't as clear-cut that it was an act of lynching. Between 1882 and 1968, the number of known lynchings was 4,743. It's impossible to know the true number, but it illustrates the fight Wells waged her entire life, which continued long after the anti-lynching crusader passed away. Ida never won the fight against lynching. She just gave her voice to the fight for a more just union, a more equal America, and her voice remained one of the loudest. Her efforts to bring attention to the horrors of a post-slavery America may not have resulted in legislative change, but that doesn't diminish its importance or everything she achieved for civil rights during her lifetime. Remember that freedom is not free. We must remain vigilant against those who would pervert our Constitution and destroy our democratic republic. In the words of George Carlin, rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're privileges. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, deploy your likes, comment a figure we should cover next, subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.